Margaret Harrison looked at her expensive watch and sighed. It was already 6:30 in the evening and she was tired. Her feet hurt from walking in high heels all day. She had been showing houses to rich people who wanted to buy fancy homes. Margaret was a real estate agent and she was very good at her job. She always dressed nicely and spoke in a polite way to her clients. Today had been a long day. She had shown 3 different houses to 3 different families. All the houses cost more than $1 million. Margaret liked working with rich people because they paid her a lot of money when they bought expensive houses. She thought she was better than people who did not have much money. Margaret walked to the bus stop on 5th Street. She usually drove her car, but it was in the repair shop today. The mechanic said it would be ready tomorrow. Margaret did not like taking the bus. She thought buses were for poor people who could not afford cars. But she had no choice today. The bus arrived 5 minutes later. It was crowded with people going home from work. Margaret looked inside and saw many different types of people. There were office workers in suits, students with backpacks, and working people in simple clothes. Margaret felt uncomfortable. She was not used to being around so many different people. Margaret climbed onto the bus and paid her fare. She looked around for a place to sit. Most of the seats were full. She walked slowly down the aisle, looking for an empty seat. Her high heels made clicking sounds on the floor of the bus. Then she saw an empty seat near the middle of the bus, but there was a woman sitting in the seat next to it. Margaret looked at this woman and felt disgusted. The woman was wearing old, faded jeans with holes in them. Her shirt was wrinkled and had paint stains on it. Her hair looked like she had not washed it in days. It was messy and tied back with a rubber band. The woman had a worn canvas bag on her lap. The bag looked very old and dirty. Margaret could see paint stains on the bag, too. The woman was looking down at something in her hands. Margaret moved closer and saw that the woman was drawing in a small notebook. Her hands also had paint stains on them. Margaret stopped walking and stared at the woman. She could not believe someone could look so messy and poor. Margaret always made sure she looked perfect. Her hair was always styled nicely. Her clothes were always clean and expensive. Her nails were always painted and neat. Margaret looked at the empty seat next to the messy woman. She really wanted to sit down because her feet hurt, but she did not want to sit next to someone who looked so poor and dirty. What would people think of her? Margaret cared a lot about what other people thought. She decided to keep looking for another seat. Margaret walked further down the aisle, but all the other seats were taken. She walked back toward the front of the bus. Still no empty seats. The only place to sit was next to the woman with paint-stained clothes. Margaret stood in the aisle and held onto a metal pole. She decided she would rather stand than sit next to that woman. More people got on the bus at the next stop. Now the bus was even more crowded. People were pushing against Margaret. Someone stepped on her foot. Margaret felt angry. She looked again at the empty seat next to the messy woman. The woman was still drawing in her notebook. She seemed very focused on her work. She did not look up at anyone. Margaret noticed that the woman drew very well. Even from where she stood, Margaret could see that the drawings looked good, but Margaret did not care about the woman's drawings. She only cared about how the woman looked. Margaret believed that people who looked poor were not good people. She thought they were lazy and dirty. She did not want to be near them. A man in a business suit got on the bus. He looked around for a seat. Margaret watched as he walked toward the empty seat next to the messy woman. But when he saw the woman, he also decided not to sit there. He chose to stand instead, just like Margaret. Margaret felt good about this. She thought the man in the suit understood just like she did. Poor-looking people should not sit next to well-dressed people. Margaret believed this was the right way to think. An elderly woman got on the bus at the next stop. She looked tired and was carrying heavy shopping bags. The elderly woman walked slowly toward the empty seat. Margaret watched to see what would happen. The elderly woman sat down next to the messy woman without hesitation. The woman with paint stains looked up from her notebook and smiled at the elderly woman. She even helped the elderly woman put her shopping bags in a safe place. Margaret was surprised. The messy woman seemed very kind and polite, but Margaret still did not want to sit there. She believed that just because someone was kind did not mean they were good enough to sit next to her. Margaret thought that appearance was the most important thing about a person. The bus stopped again and more people got on. Now Margaret was being pushed from all sides. Someone's backpack hit her in the face. A teenager's elbow bumped into her arm. Margaret was getting very uncomfortable standing in the crowded aisle. She looked at the seat next to the messy woman again. It was still the only empty seat on the whole bus. Margaret really wanted to sit down, but her pride would not let her. She thought sitting next to that woman would make her look bad. Margaret started to feel sick from standing on the moving bus. The bus driver hit the brakes suddenly and Margaret almost fell down. She grabbed the metal pole tighter. Her hands were starting to hurt from holding on so tight. The woman with paint stains looked up from her notebook for a moment. She glanced around the bus and saw how crowded it was. Her eyes met Margaret's eyes for just a second. The woman's eyes were kind and intelligent. She looked back down at her notebook and continued drawing. Margaret felt something strange when she looked into the woman's eyes. For just a moment, she felt like maybe she was wrong about this person. But then Margaret pushed that feeling away. She had made up her mind. She would not sit next to someone who looked so poor and messy. The bus ride continued, and Margaret kept standing in the uncomfortable, crowded aisle. She was too proud to sit in the only empty seat. She did not know that this decision would soon change her life in a way she never expected. The woman sitting by herself, drawing quietly in her notebook, was not at all what Margaret thought she was. The bus got more crowded at every stop. Margaret was still standing in the aisle, holding tight to the metal pole. Her feet hurt more now and she was getting angry. She kept looking at the empty seat next to the woman with paint-stained clothes. The seat was still empty because no one wanted to sit there. Margaret noticed a well-dressed businessman standing near her. He was wearing an expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase. Margaret thought he looked like the kind of person she usually talked to. She decided to start a conversation with him. "Can you believe this?" Margaret said to the businessman, speaking loud enough for other people to hear. "This bus is so crowded, but there's an empty seat right there." She pointed toward the woman with the messy clothes. The businessman looked where Margaret was pointing. He saw the woman drawing in her notebook. "Oh," he said quietly. He did not seem to want to talk about it, but Margaret kept talking. "I mean, look at her," Margaret said, making sure her voice was loud. "She looks like she hasn't taken a bath in weeks. And those clothes. They're covered in paint and dirt. People like that should not be on the same bus as decent people." Some passengers turned to look at Margaret. A few people looked uncomfortable with what she was saying. But Margaret did not notice. She thought everyone agreed with her. The woman with paint stains heard what Margaret was saying. She looked up from her notebook for a moment. Margaret saw the woman's face clearly for the first time. Even though the woman's hair was messy and her clothes were old, her face was beautiful. She had kind eyes and perfect features. But Margaret only saw the messy hair and old clothes. The woman did not say anything. She just looked at Margaret for a few seconds, then went back to her drawing. Margaret thought this proved her point. "See?" Margaret said to the businessman. "She knows she doesn't belong here with respectable people." A young mother with a small child was sitting across the aisle. She heard Margaret's comments and frowned. "Maybe you shouldn't judge people by how they look," the young mother said quietly. Margaret turned to look at the young mother. "Excuse me?" Margaret said in a sharp voice. "I'm just saying what everyone is thinking. Look at that woman. She obviously has no pride in herself. People who dress like that and don't take care of themselves are usually trouble." The young mother shook her head and looked away. She did not want to argue with Margaret, but other passengers were starting to pay attention to what Margaret was saying. Margaret felt confident now. She thought people were listening to her because they agreed with her. "I work very hard for my money," Margaret continued. "I dress nicely and act properly. I shouldn't have to share space with people who don't have any standards." An older man sitting near the front of the bus turned around. "Lady, maybe you should mind your own business," he said firmly. Margaret felt shocked. She did not expect anyone to disagree with her. "I'm just stating facts," Margaret said. "Look at her clothes. Look at her hair. People like that are usually on drugs or they're lazy. They probably don't even have jobs." The woman with paint stains looked up again when Margaret said this. This time, she stared directly at Margaret for several seconds. Her eyes were not angry, but they were very serious. Margaret felt uncomfortable under the woman's stare, but she did not stop talking. "I bet she's going to ask people for money," Margaret said, speaking even louder now. "That's what people like that do. They ride buses and bother hardworking people for handouts." A teenage girl sitting near the back of the bus spoke up. "You're being really mean," she said to Margaret. "That lady isn't bothering anyone. She's just sitting there drawing. Margaret turned to look at the teenager. Young lady, when you're older, you'll understand. You have to be careful about the kind of people you associate with. Standards matter. The businessman next to Margaret started to move away from her. He did not want to be part of the conversation anymore. Margaret did not notice that he was trying to get away from her. I pay taxes, Margaret continued. I contribute to society. I shouldn't have to deal with people who obviously don't contribute anything. Look at those paint stains. She probably doesn't even have a real job. The woman with paint stains closed her notebook and put it in her canvas bag. Margaret thought this meant the woman was getting ready to leave the bus. Good, Margaret said loudly. Maybe now decent people can sit down. But the woman did not get up to leave. She just sat there quietly looking out the window. Margaret felt frustrated that her comments had not made the woman leave. A college student sitting behind the woman leaned forward and whispered something to her friend. Margaret could not hear what they were saying, but she saw them looking at the woman with paint stains and then looking at their phones. Margaret thought they were probably taking pictures to make fun of the woman on social media. This made Margaret feel proud. She thought she was right to point out how inappropriate the woman looked. People need to have some pride, Margaret said to anyone who would listen. They need to dress properly and act right. This woman clearly has no self-respect. And if you don't respect yourself, how can you respect others? The bus driver looked in his mirror and saw what was happening. Hey, lady, he called back to Margaret. Keep it down back there. Let people ride in peace. Margaret felt embarrassed that the bus driver had called her out, but she still thought she was right. I'm just trying to have a conversation, Margaret said defensively. The woman with paint stains reached into her canvas bag and pulled out her phone. Margaret watched as the woman checked her messages. Even the woman's phone looked old and cheap to Margaret. Probably a government phone, Margaret whispered to herself, but loud enough for others to hear. Paid for by taxpayers like me. More passengers were now staring at Margaret instead of the woman with paint stains. Some people looked angry at Margaret. Others looked embarrassed for her. But Margaret did not understand that people were upset with her behavior, not with the quiet woman. The bus made another stop, and several people got off. But the woman with paint stains stayed in her seat. Margaret was disappointed. She had hoped the woman would leave so that Margaret could finally sit down. Margaret's feet were really hurting now. She had been standing for almost 30 minutes. But she was too proud to sit next to the woman she had been criticizing. Margaret had made such a big deal about not wanting to sit there that she could not change her mind now. The woman with paint stains looked at Margaret one more time. This time, the woman's expression was different. She looked like she felt sorry for Margaret. This made Margaret even more angry. How dare this messy woman feel sorry for her? Margaret was successful and well-dressed. The woman with paint stains was obviously poor and probably homeless. Margaret did not know that her loud comments and rude behavior were about to have consequences she never expected. The bus continued down the busy street, stopping every few blocks to pick up and drop off passengers. Margaret was still standing in the aisle, her feet aching in her expensive high heels. She had been complaining about the woman with paint-stained clothes for almost 10 minutes now. But most passengers were trying to ignore her. Near the back of the bus, a college student named Sarah was sitting with her roommate Emma. Sarah had been watching the quiet woman with the notebook since she got on the bus. Something about the woman seemed familiar, but Sarah could not figure out what it was. Sarah whispered to Emma, "That woman sitting by herself, doesn't she look familiar to you?" Emma looked toward the front of the bus where the woman was sitting. "Which woman?" Emma asked. "The one with the messy hair and paint stains," Sarah said quietly. "The one that rude lady has been talking about." Emma looked more carefully. The woman was holding her notebook again, but she was not drawing anymore. She was just sitting quietly looking out the window. "I don't know," Emma said. "Why, do you think you know her?" Sarah stared at the woman for a long time. There was something about her face that seemed very familiar. Even with the messy hair and old clothes, the woman had beautiful features. Her nose was perfect and her eyes were large and expressive. Sarah felt like she had seen this face before, but not in real life. "I think I've seen her in a movie or something," Sarah whispered to Emma. "But that can't be right. Why would an actress be on a city bus looking like that?" Emma looked again. "Are you sure? She doesn't look like any actress I know. Look at her clothes. And her hair is such a mess." But Sarah could not shake the feeling that she knew this woman from somewhere. She pulled out her phone and started looking through pictures of actresses on the internet. She scrolled through dozens of photos, trying to find the face that matched the woman on the bus. Margaret was still standing near the front of the bus, continuing her complaints. "I just don't understand why people don't take pride in their appearance anymore," Margaret said to anyone who would listen. "When I was young, people dressed properly when they went out in public." A middle-aged man sitting across from Margaret finally spoke up. "Lady, why don't you just sit down and mind your own business? That woman isn't bothering anyone." Margaret felt insulted. "I have every right to express my opinion," she said angrily. "And I would sit down if there was a decent place to sit. But I'm not going to sit next to someone who obviously has no standards." The woman with paint stains heard this comment. She looked up at Margaret with a small, sad smile. It was the kind of smile that showed she felt sorry for Margaret, not angry at her. This made Margaret even more upset. Sarah was still looking at her phone, searching through pictures of actresses. Suddenly, she stopped scrolling. She had found a photo that made her heart beat faster. It was a picture from last month's Academy Awards ceremony. The photo showed a beautiful woman in an elegant dress holding a golden statue. Sarah looked at the photo, then looked at the woman on the bus, then back at the photo. Even though the woman on the bus looked completely different, Sarah was now sure it was the same person. The eyes were exactly the same. The shape of the face was identical. The smile was the same too. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered to Emma. "I know who that is." "Who?" Emma asked, leaning closer to see Sarah's phone. Sarah showed Emma the photo on her phone. "It's Elena Rodriguez," Sarah whispered very quietly. "She won the Oscar for Best Actress last month. That's her sitting right there." Emma looked at the photo, then at the woman on the bus. "No way," Emma said. "That can't be her. Look how she's dressed. And her hair." "It's definitely her," Sarah said. "I'm sure of it. I've seen all her movies." "I know that face." Emma stared at the woman more carefully. Now that Sarah had pointed it out, Emma could see the resemblance too. But why would a famous actress be on a public bus looking like that? Emma asked. Sarah remembered reading articles about Elena Rodriguez. "She's famous for being really down to earth," Sarah whispered. "I read that she likes to dress in regular clothes and do normal things. She says it helps her stay connected to real people." The two college students looked at each other with excitement. They were sitting on a bus with one of the most famous actresses in the world, and almost nobody knew it. Meanwhile, a rude woman was insulting the actress without knowing who she was. Sarah felt like she should do something. She wanted to say hello to Elena Rodriguez, but she also did not want to cause a scene. She could see that the actress was trying to keep a low profile. Sarah decided to approach carefully. Sarah got up from her seat and slowly walked toward the front of the bus. Margaret was still standing in the aisle, continuing to complain about the woman's appearance. Sarah ignored Margaret and stopped near Elena Rodriguez's seat. "Excuse me," Sarah said very quietly so only Elena could hear. "Are you Elena Rodriguez?" Elena looked up at Sarah with surprise. For a moment, she looked like she was going to deny it. But then she saw Sarah's kind face and friendly smile. Elena smiled back and nodded her head slightly. "I'm a huge fan of your work," Sarah whispered. "I don't want to bother you, but I just wanted to say that I loved your last movie." Elena's smile became bigger and warmer. "Thank you so much," Elena whispered back. "That's very kind of you to say." Sarah wanted to ask for a photo or an autograph, but she could see that Elena was trying to travel quietly. "I won't tell anyone," Sarah promised. "I can see you want some privacy." Elena looked grateful. "I appreciate that," she whispered. "I like to travel this way sometimes. It helps me understand the characters I play." Margaret had stopped talking for a moment, and she noticed Sarah talking to the woman with paint stains. This annoyed Margaret even more. "Great," Margaret said loudly. "Now that woman is bothering other passengers." "I told you people like that were trouble." Sarah heard Margaret's comment and felt angry. She wanted to tell Margaret who she was really talking about, but she had promised Elena she would keep quiet. Sarah looked at Elena apologetically. Elena just smiled and shook her head as if to say it was okay. She was used to people judging her by her appearance when she dressed down. It was part of why she did it. It helped her understand how regular people were treated. Sarah walked back to her seat, trying to contain her excitement. She sat down next to Emma, who was waiting eagerly to hear what had happened. "It's really her," Sarah whispered to Emma. "She's so nice, but she asked me not to tell anyone." Emma looked toward Elena Rodriguez with new respect. I can't believe a famous actress is just sitting there while that woman insults her. Margaret continued standing in the aisle, unaware that she had been insulting one of the most respected actresses in Hollywood. She had no idea that her behavior was about to become much more embarrassing than she could ever imagine. Margaret was still standing in the crowded aisle when her phone started ringing. She looked at the screen and saw the name Mrs. Pemberton displayed. Margaret's heart jumped with excitement. Mrs. Pemberton was her most important client, a very wealthy widow who was looking to buy a mansion worth several $1,000,000. Margaret quickly answered the phone. "Hello, Mrs. Pemberton. How wonderful to hear from you," Margaret said in her sweetest voice. She always spoke differently to rich clients than she did to regular people. "Hello, Margaret." Mrs. Pemberton's elegant voice came through the phone. "I'm calling from the Children's Hospital Charity Gala. It's absolutely wonderful here. They've raised over $2 million tonight for the new children's wing." Margaret tried to sound interested, even though she did not really care about charity. "That sounds amazing, Mrs. Pemberton. I'm sure it's a lovely event." "Oh, it truly is," Mrs. Pemberton continued. "And you'll never guess who's here. That wonderful actress, Elena Rodriguez, is the guest of honor. She donated $1 million of her own money to the hospital. Can you believe that?" Margaret felt confused. She had heard the name Elena Rodriguez before, but she could not remember where. "Elena Rodriguez?" Margaret repeated. "Yes, dear. She's the actress who won the Academy Award last month. Such a talented and beautiful woman. And so humble. She's been talking to everyone here like they're old friends. She even helped serve dinner to the children in the hospital ward earlier today." Mrs. Pemberton's voice was full of admiration. "You know, Margaret, Elena Rodriguez is exactly the kind of person I respect. She has money and fame, but she uses it to help others, and she's so down to earth. She told me she often dresses in regular clothes and takes public transportation just to stay connected with everyday people." Margaret started to feel strange. Something about what Mrs. Pemberton was saying seemed familiar, but she could not figure out why. "She's standing right next to me now," Mrs. Pemberton continued. "Would you like to say hello to her?" Before Margaret could answer, she heard Mrs. Pemberton talking to someone else. "Elena, dear, would you mind saying hello to my real estate agent? She's such a big fan of movies." Margaret heard some background noise, and then Mrs. Pemberton came back on the phone. "She'll be right here, Margaret. She's just finishing a conversation with a little girl from the hospital." While Margaret waited, she looked around the bus. The woman with paint-stained clothes was also on her phone now. Margaret could see her talking quietly, but she could not hear what the woman was saying over the noise of the bus. Then Margaret heard Mrs. Pemberton's voice again. "Here she is, Margaret. I'm putting Elena on the phone now." Margaret waited to hear the famous actress speak. She expected to hear a sophisticated, elegant voice like the ones she heard in movies. But at the same time, Margaret heard a voice right next to her on the bus. The woman with paint stains was talking on her phone. "Hello, this is Elena," the woman said quietly. Margaret froze. The voice she heard through her phone was exactly the same as the voice she heard from the woman sitting just a few feet away from her. The same tone, the same accent, the same way of speaking. "Hello," the voice said through Margaret's phone. "Mrs. Pemberton tells me you're her real estate agent. It's nice to meet you, even if it's just over the phone." Margaret's face turned completely white. She looked at the woman with paint stains who was still talking on her phone. Margaret could see the woman's lips moving, and the words were matching exactly with what she heard through her own phone. Hello?" Margaret stammered into her phone. She could not believe what was happening. "Are you there?" Elena Rodriguez asked through the phone. "The connection might not be very good. I'm actually on a city bus right now, heading home from a meeting about my next movie." Margaret's hands started shaking. The woman she had been insulting for the past 20 minutes was Elena Rodriguez, the Academy Award-winning actress. The woman she had called dirty and poor was worth millions of dollars and was one of the most respected people in Hollywood. Yes, I'm here," Margaret managed to say. Her voice sounded weak and scared. "Wonderful," Elena said cheerfully through the phone. "Mrs. Pemberton tells me you help people find beautiful homes. That must be such rewarding work." Margaret could not speak. She was watching Elena Rodriguez sitting just a few feet away, talking to her on the phone. Elena had no idea that Margaret was the woman who had been making cruel comments about her appearance. "I love meeting people who help others find their dream homes," Elena continued. "Housing is so important for families. I'm actually looking for a new house myself. Something more private than where I live now. Mrs. Pemberton said you might be able to help me when I'm ready. Margaret felt sick to her stomach. Elena Rodriguez, one of the most famous people in the world, was offering to be her client. But Margaret had just spent 20 minutes insulting her without knowing who she was. Other passengers on the bus were starting to notice something strange was happening. They could see Margaret staring at the woman with paint stains while talking on her phone. Some people were beginning to realize that something was not right. Sarah, the college student who had recognized Elena earlier, was watching everything with wide eyes. She could see that Margaret was having some kind of realization. Sarah whispered to Emma, "I think that mean lady is figuring out who she's been talking about." "Margaret, are you still there?" Elena asked through the phone. "I think we might have a bad connection." Margaret tried to say something, but no words came out. She felt like she was going to faint. Her expensive clothes suddenly felt uncomfortable, and her face was burning with embarrassment. Elena continued talking through the phone. "Well, I should probably go. This bus is getting to my stop soon. It was lovely talking to you. Margaret, Mrs. Pemberton has my contact information if you'd like to help me find a house sometime." Margaret watched as Elena Rodriguez ended her phone call and put her phone back in her old canvas bag. Elena had no idea that she had just been talking to the woman who had been making fun of her appearance. Mrs. Pemberton came back on Margaret's phone. "Wasn't she lovely, Margaret? Such a kind and humble person. I do hope you can help her find a nice home when she's ready to buy." Margaret still could not speak. She was staring at Elena Rodriguez, who was now looking out the bus window again. Elena had gone back to being the quiet woman with messy hair and paint-stained clothes that Margaret had judged so harshly. "Margaret, are you all right, dear?" Mrs. Pemberton asked. "You sound very quiet." Margaret finally found her voice, but it was shaky and weak. "Yes, Mrs. Pemberton, I'm fine. Elena seems very nice." "She certainly is," Mrs. Pemberton agreed. "Well, I should get back to the gala. I'll talk to you soon about those houses I want to see. Goodbye, dear." Mrs. Pemberton hung up, leaving Margaret standing alone on the bus with her phone in her hand. She was still staring at Elena Rodriguez, who had no idea what had just happened. Margaret realized that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Margaret's face turned from white to bright red as the full weight of her mistake hit her. She was still holding her phone in her shaking hand, staring at Elena Rodriguez. The woman she had been calling dirty, poor, and worthless was actually one of the most famous and respected actresses in the world. Margaret's mind started racing as she remembered everything she had read about Elena Rodriguez. Elena was known for being kind and generous. She gave millions of dollars to charity every year. She visited children in hospitals. She helped build schools in poor countries. And she was famous for living a simple life despite her wealth and fame. Margaret also remembered reading articles about how Elena liked to dress in regular clothes and travel like a normal person. The articles said Elena did this to research her movie roles and to stay connected with everyday people. Elena had once said in an interview, "I learn more about life riding the bus than I do in fancy restaurants." Now Margaret understood why Elena had paint stains on her clothes. Elena was probably working on art for a movie role, or maybe she was taking art classes to prepare for a character. Margaret had heard that Elena always did deep research for her acting roles. Margaret looked at Elena's canvas bag and realized it was probably expensive, even though it looked old and worn. She remembered reading that Elena collected vintage items and liked things that told stories. What Margaret had thought was a cheap, dirty bag was probably worth more than Margaret's monthly salary. Even Elena's messy hair was probably intentional. Margaret recalled reading that Elena was famous for changing her appearance completely for different movie roles. She had won awards for how well she transformed herself into different characters. Elena was probably studying for a new role right now. Margaret felt sick as she remembered all the cruel things she had said. She had called Elena lazy and worthless. She had said Elena probably did not have a job. She had suggested that Elena was on drugs or homeless. All of these comments had been made about a woman who worked harder than almost anyone in Hollywood and who used her success to help other people. Margaret also realized how much money she had probably lost. Mrs. Pemberton had said that Elena was looking for a new house. Movie stars usually bought very expensive homes. If Elena had decided to work with Margaret, it could have been the biggest sale of Margaret's career. But now that was impossible. Even worse, Mrs. Pemberton clearly respected Elena Rodriguez very much. If Mrs. Pemberton found out how Margaret had treated Elena, she would probably never work with Margaret again. Mrs. Pemberton might even tell other wealthy people about Margaret's behavior. Margaret's entire business could be ruined. Margaret looked around the bus and saw that several passengers were now staring at her. Some of them had heard her phone conversation and had figured out what was happening. The college student who had talked to Elena earlier was looking at Margaret with disgust. Margaret wanted to apologize to Elena, but she did not know how. What could she possibly say? "I'm sorry I called you worthless, but I didn't know you were famous." That would make things even worse. It would show that Margaret only respected people because of their money and fame, not because they were human beings who deserved kindness. Margaret realized that her behavior on the bus had shown her true character. She had judged Elena based only on her appearance. She had been cruel and rude to someone who was just sitting quietly, not bothering anyone. Margaret had acted this way because she thought Elena was poor and powerless. Now Margaret understood how ugly her personality really was. Elena was still sitting quietly, looking out the window. She seemed peaceful and content. Margaret wondered if Elena dealt with people like her all the time. Margaret thought about how patient Elena had been. Even when Margaret was being loud and rude, Elena had never said anything mean back. She had just smiled sadly, as if she felt sorry for Margaret. Margaret remembered the look in Elena's eyes when their eyes had met earlier. Elena's eyes had been kind and intelligent. Margaret had seen something special in those eyes, but she had ignored that feeling because of Elena's clothes and hair. Now Margaret realized that she had seen the same eyes that millions of people around the world loved in movies. Margaret also thought about Elena's drawings. Even from far away, Margaret had been able to see that Elena drew very well. Margaret should have realized that someone with such artistic talent was probably not just a random homeless person. But Margaret had been so focused on judging Elena's appearance that she had ignored all the signs that Elena was special. The bus made another stop, and Margaret hoped Elena would get off. Margaret wanted Elena to leave so she would not have to face the shame of being near her anymore, but Elena stayed in her seat. Margaret realized that Elena had no idea what Margaret was going through. Elena did not know that Margaret had figured out who she was. Margaret started to panic. She knew she had to do something, but she did not know what. Should she apologize? Should she pretend nothing had happened? Should she try to start a friendly conversation? Every option seemed terrible. Margaret thought about trying to network with Elena for business purposes. Maybe she could approach Elena and offer to help her find a house. But Margaret realized how awful that would be. She had just spent 20 minutes being cruel to Elena. Now she wanted to be nice only because she knew Elena was rich and famous. That would make Margaret look even worse. Margaret also realized that other people on the bus were watching her. If she suddenly tried to be friendly to Elena, everyone would know she was only doing it because she had found out Elena was famous. The other passengers had heard Margaret's cruel comments. They would see right through any attempt to be nice now. Margaret felt trapped. She had created a situation where anything she did would make her look bad. If she apologized, it would seem fake. If she tried to be friendly, it would seem like she only cared about Elena's fame and money. If she did nothing, she would have to live with the shame of knowing she had been cruel to someone who did not deserve it. For the first time in her life, Margaret began to understand how wrong her thinking had been. She had always judged people by their appearance and their money. She had thought this made her smart and superior, but now she saw that it had made her cruel and shallow. Margaret looked at Elena Rodriguez again. Elena was still drawing in her notebook, creating art with the same hands that Margaret had called dirty. Elena was still wearing the same clothes that Margaret had called disgusting, but now Margaret could see the beauty and dignity that had been there all along. Margaret realized that Elena Rodriguez was everything that Margaret pretended to be. Elena was truly elegant, not because of her clothes, but because of her character. Elena was truly successful not just because she had money, but because she used her success to help others. Elena was truly respectable, not because people feared her, but because she earned their love and admiration. Margaret, on the other hand, had just shown herself to be petty, cruel, and shallow. She had revealed that all her expensive clothes and fancy manners were just a mask covering an ugly personality. Margaret had thought she was better than Elena, but she was actually much worse. Margaret's panic grew stronger as she realized she had to do something before Elena got off the bus. She could not let this opportunity pass by. Even though she felt terrible about her behavior, Margaret's business instincts were still working. She knew that having Elena Rodriguez as a client could save her career and make her rich. Margaret took a deep breath and tried to calm herself down. She fixed her hair and straightened her expensive jacket. Then she walked slowly toward Elena's seat, trying to look confident and professional. "Excuse me," Margaret said in her sweetest voice as she approached Elena. "I couldn't help but notice your beautiful artwork. Are you an artist?" Elena looked up from her notebook with surprise. This was the same woman who had been saying cruel things about her for the past 20 minutes. Elena's eyes showed confusion, but she answered politely. "Thank you. I do draw sometimes, yes." Margaret smiled her biggest fake smile. "I'm Margaret Harrison. I'm a real estate agent here in the city. I work with many creative people, helping them find the perfect homes for their art studios." Several passengers turned to watch this conversation. They remembered Margaret's earlier comments about Elena, and they could see that Margaret was now trying to be friendly. The college student Sarah shook her head in disgust. The businessman who had tried to avoid Margaret earlier rolled his eyes. Elena was being polite, but Margaret could see that she was not very interested in talking. "That's nice," Elena said simply. She started to close her notebook, preparing to put it away, but Margaret was desperate. She sat down in the empty seat next to Elena without being invited. "You know, I have many clients in the entertainment industry," Margaret lied. "Actors, directors, producers. They all trust me to find them the perfect homes." Elena looked uncomfortable now. She moved slightly away from Margaret and held her canvas bag closer to her body. "I see," Elena said quietly. Margaret did not notice Elena's discomfort. She was too focused on trying to impress her. "I specialize in luxury properties," Margaret continued. "Mansions, penthouses, private estates. I understand the special needs of successful people who value their privacy." Some passengers were now openly staring at Margaret. An elderly woman shook her head and whispered, "Shameful," loud enough for others to hear. A teenager took out his phone and started recording the conversation. Elena glanced around and saw that people were watching them. She seemed to understand that something strange was happening, but she was not sure what it was. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been some confusion," Elena said gently. Margaret felt panic rising in her chest. Elena was trying to end the conversation, and Margaret had not made her sales pitch yet. "No confusion at all," Margaret said, speaking louder now. "I can see that you're a sophisticated person with refined taste. I could help you find exactly the kind of home you deserve." Elena looked even more confused. Just minutes ago, this woman had been saying that Elena looked poor and dirty. Now the same woman was calling her sophisticated and refined. Elena started to suspect that something had happened to change Margaret's opinion of her. "I think you have me confused with someone else," Elena said carefully. "I'm just a regular person taking the bus home." Margaret laughed nervously. "Oh, please. I can tell quality when I see it. You have an artistic eye. Elegant features, perfect bone structure. You're clearly someone special." The passengers were now listening openly to Margaret's words. Some of them laughed quietly at how different Margaret sounded now compared to 20 minutes ago. The man who had told Margaret to mind her own business earlier spoke up again. "Lady, weren't you just saying this woman looked like trouble?" The man asked loudly. "What changed your mind all of a sudden?" Margaret's face turned red. She had been caught and she knew it. I was mistaken earlier," Margaret stammered. "I was having a bad day and I wasn't thinking clearly." Elena's eyes widened as she began to understand what was happening. She looked at Margaret with new awareness. "You were talking about me earlier," Elena asked quietly. Margaret tried to deny it, but the other passengers would not let her. "She was saying awful things about you for 20 minutes, the teenager with the phone said. "She called you dirty and poor. She said you probably didn't have a job." Elena looked at Margaret with disappointment rather than anger. "I see," Elena said sadly. Margaret felt desperate now. She could see that Elena was hurt and offended. "I'm so sorry," Margaret said quickly. "I made a terrible mistake. I judged you unfairly. I hope you can forgive me." But Elena could see through Margaret's fake apology. "What made you change your mind about me?" Elena asked. "Did something happen?" Margaret did not know how to answer. She could not admit that she only started being nice because she found out Elena was famous. That would make her look even worse. The college student Sarah decided to speak up. "She figured out who you really are," Sarah said to Elena. "I think she got a phone call or something." Elena nodded slowly. Now she understood everything. Margaret had not apologized because she felt bad about being cruel. Margaret had only changed her behavior because she discovered Elena was famous and wealthy. "I understand now," Elena said quietly. She stood up from her seat, gathering her notebook and canvas bag. "This is my stop anyway," Margaret panicked. "Wait, please don't go. I would really love to help you find a beautiful home. I have connections throughout the city. I could show you some amazing properties." Elena looked at Margaret with sad eyes. "I don't think that would be appropriate," Elena said gently. "I think you and I have very different values about how people should treat each other." The bus stopped and Elena moved toward the exit. Margaret followed her, still trying to salvage the situation. "Please just give me a chance to make this right. I can be very helpful to you. I have excellent references." Elena paused at the bus door and turned back to Margaret. "You know what would make this right?" Elena asked. "If you treated every person on this bus with the same respect you're showing me now, not because they're famous or wealthy, but because they're human beings who deserve kindness." Elena stepped off the bus, leaving Margaret standing in the doorway. Margaret wanted to follow her, but she knew it would be pointless. Elena Rodriguez was gone, and with her went Margaret's biggest potential business opportunity. As Margaret walked back to her seat, she could feel every passenger on the bus staring at her. Some looked angry, some looked disgusted, and some looked like they felt sorry for her. Margaret had never felt so ashamed in her entire life. The teenager who had been recording held up his phone. "I got the whole thing," he announced to the bus. "This is definitely going on social media." Margaret felt her stomach drop. Not only had she lost Elena Rodriguez as a potential client, but her behavior was about to be seen by thousands of people online. Margaret realized that her reputation, her business, and her entire life were about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The teenager named Jake uploaded the video to social media as soon as he got home from the bus. He wrote a caption that said, "Rich lady insults poor woman on bus, then finds out she's a famous actress. Watch her try to change her tune." Jake sent the video to his friends, who shared it with their friends, who shared it with even more people. Within 2 hours, the video had been watched by thousands of people. Within 6 hours, it had over 100,000 views. By the next morning, it had been seen by more than 2 million people around the world. The video clearly showed Margaret's business card, which she had been waving around earlier when she was bragging about her successful career. People could see her name, her company, and her phone number. They could also hear every cruel comment she had made about Elena Rodriguez. People on social media were angry about Margaret's behavior. They wrote comments calling her shallow, rude, and prejudiced. They said she was everything that was wrong with society. Some people shared their own stories about being judged unfairly because of how they looked. Elena Rodriguez's fans were especially upset. Elena was loved by millions of people because she was known for being kind and humble. People felt protective of her and angry that someone had treated her so badly. The video was shared on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. News websites picked up the story. A popular morning television show played the video and discussed it with their hosts. Radio stations talked about it. The story spread everywhere. Margaret woke up the next morning to find hundreds of missed calls and text messages on her phone. Her voicemail was full of angry messages from strangers who had seen the video. Some people called her names. Others threatened to ruin her business. A few people even said they knew where she lived. Margaret's business phone was also ringing constantly. But these were not potential customers calling to buy houses. These were people calling to tell Margaret what they thought of her behavior. Margaret had to turn off her business phone because the calls would not stop. Margaret's boss at the real estate company called her into his office that morning. "Margaret, we need to talk," he said seriously. He showed her the video on his computer. "This has been sent to me by dozens of people. Our company name is clearly visible in the video." Margaret tried to explain, but her boss held up his hand to stop her. "Margaret, this behavior is completely unacceptable. You've embarrassed our company and made us look bad. I have no choice but to let you go. Margaret felt shocked. But I've been your best agent for 5 years, she protested. I make more money for this company than anyone else. Not anymore, her boss said sadly. 3 of our biggest clients have already called to say they don't want to work with us as long as you're here. We can't afford to keep you. Margaret left the real estate office in a daze. She had lost her job because of a 30-minute bus ride. She drove home and found news reporters waiting outside her house. She had to sneak in through her back door to avoid them. Margaret's phone kept ringing all day. Finally, she answered a call from Mrs. Pemberton, her most important client. Margaret hoped Mrs. Pemberton was calling to offer support. Margaret, I'm very disappointed in you, Mrs. Pemberton said coldly. I saw the video of your behavior on the bus. That woman you were insulting was Elena Rodriguez, who I consider a friend. I can't believe you treated her so cruelly. Margaret tried to apologize. Mrs. Pemberton, I made a terrible mistake. I was having a bad day and I wasn't thinking clearly. Please give me another chance. Absolutely not, Mrs. Pemberton said firmly. What you did shows your true character. If you can be so cruel to someone you think is poor and powerless, then you're not the kind of person I want to do business with. I'm canceling our contract immediately. Mrs. Pemberton hung up before Margaret could say anything else. Over the next few days, all of Margaret's other wealthy clients called to cancel their contracts too. Word had spread quickly through the social circles of rich people. Nobody wanted to work with Margaret anymore. Margaret tried to find work with other real estate companies, but nobody would hire her. The video had made her too famous for all the wrong reasons. Every time she applied for a job, the employer would recognize her name and turn her down. Margaret's friends started avoiding her too. They were embarrassed to be associated with someone who had become famous for being cruel and prejudiced. Margaret found herself alone with no job, no clients, and no support from the people she had thought were her friends. Meanwhile, Elena Rodriguez handled the situation with grace and dignity. She gave an interview to a popular magazine about the experience. I wasn't surprised by what happened, Elena said. Unfortunately, people judge others by their appearance all the time. I hope this incident will help people think more carefully about their prejudices. Elena also said she felt sorry for Margaret. I think she's learned a hard lesson about treating people with kindness and respect. I hope she can grow from this experience and become a better person. Elena's kind response to the situation made people love her even more. Several charities asked her to become their spokesperson for campaigns against prejudice and discrimination. Elena agreed, turning the negative experience into something positive that could help other people. Margaret watched Elena's interview on television and felt even worse about herself. Elena had every right to be angry, but instead she was using the situation to help make the world a better place. This made Margaret realize how different they were as people. Margaret also realized that Elena had been telling the truth about her character all along. Even when Margaret was being cruel to her, Elena had remained kind and patient. Elena had not fought back or been mean in return. She had simply felt sorry for Margaret, understanding that Margaret's cruelty came from her own unhappiness and insecurity. As the weeks passed, Margaret watched her entire life fall apart. She had to sell her expensive car because she could not afford the payments anymore. She had to move out of her luxury apartment and find a cheaper place to live. She had to shop at discount stores instead of expensive boutiques. For the first time in her adult life, Margaret understood what it felt like to struggle financially. She began to realize how difficult life could be for people without money and privilege. She started to understand why Elena Rodriguez worked so hard to help people who were less fortunate than herself. Margaret knew that she had created this situation with her own cruel behavior. She had judged Elena Rodriguez unfairly and treated her with disrespect. Now Margaret was facing the consequences of her actions, and she was finally beginning to understand how wrong she had been about everything. 6 months after the bus incident, Margaret's life looked completely different. She was working part-time at a small coffee shop to pay her bills. Her expensive clothes had been replaced with simple, practical outfits. She lived in a tiny apartment in a neighborhood she had once looked down upon. At first, Margaret had felt angry and sorry for herself. She blamed the teenager who filmed her, the people who shared the video, and even Elena Rodriguez for not stopping the situation from getting worse. Margaret spent weeks feeling like a victim of unfair treatment, but as time passed, Margaret began to see things differently. She started to understand that nobody had forced her to be cruel to Elena on the bus. Nobody had made her judge Elena by her appearance. Margaret had chosen to act that way because of her own prejudices and insecurities. Working at the coffee shop taught Margaret important lessons. She served customers from all walks of life. Some were rich, some were poor, some were well-dressed, and some wore simple clothes. Margaret learned that a person's character had nothing to do with their appearance or bank account. She met a regular customer named David, who came in every morning wearing paint-stained work clothes. At first, Margaret assumed he was a poor construction worker, but she learned that David was actually a successful artist who owned several galleries. He dressed simply because he did not care about impressing people with expensive clothes. Margaret also met Sarah, a woman who came in wearing designer suits and jewelry. Margaret assumed Sarah was wealthy and successful, but Sarah told Margaret that she was actually deep in debt, buying expensive clothes to try to impress clients for a business that was failing. Sarah's fancy appearance was hiding financial problems and personal struggles. These experiences helped Margaret understand that appearances could be very deceiving. She realized that she had been wrong to judge people based on how they looked or what they wore. One day, while Margaret was working at the coffee shop, she saw a news report on the television about a new children's hospital wing that had just opened. Elena Rodriguez had helped raise the money for it and had visited the children on opening day. Margaret watched Elena playing with sick children, reading them stories and making them laugh. Margaret felt a deep sadness as she watched Elena's kindness and generosity. She realized that while Elena was using her fame and wealth to help children, Margaret had spent years only caring about making money for herself. Margaret had never volunteered to help anyone or donated money to charity. That evening, Margaret looked up volunteer opportunities in her area. She found a homeless shelter that needed people to help serve meals. Margaret was nervous about volunteering because she had always avoided homeless people, but she decided she needed to face her prejudices and try to become a better person. Margaret's first day at the homeless shelter was difficult. She felt uncomfortable and scared. Some of the homeless people looked exactly like the kind of people Margaret had always judged and avoided. But the volunteer coordinator, a kind woman named Linda, helped Margaret understand that homeless people were just regular people who had faced difficult circumstances. Linda told Margaret stories about the shelter's clients. There was a former teacher who lost his job and his home after getting sick. There was a single mother who became homeless after escaping an abusive relationship. There was a veteran who struggled with mental health problems after returning from war. Margaret began to realize that any of these people could have been her. If she had gotten sick, lost her job, or faced other problems, she might have ended up homeless too. Being poor or homeless did not make someone a bad person. It just meant they were going through a hard time. As Margaret continued volunteering at the shelter, she met people who challenged all her old beliefs. She met homeless people who were college graduates, former business owners, and talented artists. She met people who had lost everything but still maintained their dignity and kindness. Margaret also met volunteers from all different backgrounds. Some were wealthy people who gave their time to help others. Some were middle-class people who wanted to make a difference. Some were former homeless people who now had homes but still came back to help others. Working at the shelter taught Margaret that true worth came from how you treated other people, not from how much money you had or what clothes you wore. She learned that kindness, compassion, and generosity were more valuable than wealth or status. After several months of volunteering, Margaret received an unexpected letter. It was from Elena Rodriguez's assistant, asking if Margaret would be interested in meeting with Elena to discuss Margaret's volunteer work. Margaret was shocked. She could not believe that Elena Rodriguez had heard about her volunteer work or that Elena would want to meet with her after what had happened on the bus. The meeting took place at a small cafe near the homeless shelter. Elena arrived wearing simple jeans and a sweater, looking much like she had on the bus that day. But this time Margaret saw Elena's true beauty, which came from her kindness and inner strength, not from her clothes or appearance. "I heard about your work at the shelter," Elena said warmly. "Linda speaks very highly of you. She says you've become one of their most dedicated volunteers." Margaret felt embarrassed. "I have a lot to make up for," Margaret said honestly. "I was a terrible person before and I'm trying to become better." Elena smiled. "We all make mistakes, Margaret. What matters is what we do after we realize we've been wrong. You could have stayed angry and bitter about what happened to you. Instead, you chose to learn and grow. That takes courage." Elena told Margaret that she was starting a new foundation to help people who had lost their jobs learn new skills. I could use someone who understands what it's like to lose everything and start over, Elena said. Would you be interested in helping me with this project? Margaret felt tears in her eyes. She could not believe that Elena was offering her a chance to work together after everything that had happened. Why would you want to help me? Margaret asked. Because I believe people can change, Elena said simply, and because the world needs more people who have learned to see others with compassion instead of judgment. Margaret accepted Elena's offer and began working with the foundation. She used her experience of losing her career and her home to help other people who were going through similar struggles. She taught classes on how to rebuild your life after setbacks. She counseled people who had lost their jobs and felt hopeless about the future. Margaret's new work gave her a sense of purpose she had never felt when she was selling expensive houses to rich people. She realized that helping others was much more fulfilling than just making money for herself. Margaret also learned to dress more simply and to care less about appearances. She discovered that when you focus on being kind and helpful, people respect you for your character, not for your clothes or possessions. Years later, Margaret often thought about that day on the bus when she had judged Elena Rodriguez so harshly. She was grateful for what had happened, even though it had been painful at the time. Losing everything had forced Margaret to examine her values and change her life for the better. Margaret realized that Elena Rodriguez had taught her the most important lesson of her life, that every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance, their wealth, or their circumstances. Margaret had learned that true success comes not from what you have, but from how you treat other people and how you use your life to make the world a better place. The incident on the bus had ended Margaret's old life, but it had also given her the chance to start a new, more meaningful life. Margaret was finally the kind of person she should have been all along.